Wow, it's been a long journey. I'll start with the talk now. Good evening, I'm James Sueur. I'm chair of the Department of History at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Ambassador Komichek, General Counsel Lysik, Chancellor Green, distinguished Prague Spring speakers and guests, students, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and those watching around the world, welcome to the Department of History's Field of Dreams. 2 years ago, as a newly appointed chair, I realized that the philanthropic brilliance of my department's patrons had given history an opportunity to host an extraordinary event. This week-long gathering, known as Prague Spring 50, or now hashtag Prague Spring 50, is the largest of its kind in the world and possible only because of the generosity and charity of Frank A. Belusik, a 1923 alumnus whose foundation gift to my department has allowed us to advance Czech history and culture in Nebraska. Today's keynote talk by Dr. Michael Žantovský is made possible because of the kindness and support of Captain Raymond Schmidt, who is here with us somewhere today. I did not see Raymond come in. Raymond, there you are. I'll talk to you afterwards. The History Alumni Council and its president, Jack Campbell, also here today, have helped us in innumerable ways. The other person that's very important is Joe Vosovo, the lion of the Lincoln Czechs. He has been a constant inspiration and sounding board. On behalf of my department, the university, and the state of Nebraska, which, as you've just heard, hosts one of the largest and most active Czech and Slovak populations in the country, I welcome you to the University of Nebraska, and I want to wish you the best, but I also would like to encourage you to help us think through what it means to have a Field of Dreams, because sponsors and people who help the university that help us dream through our biggest dreams and help us maintain that Field of Dreams. If we build it, they will come faith in our educational mission. We are blessed and grateful. Thank you all. Two years ago, Prague Spring 50 was conceived as a commemorative tribute to the women and men whose lives were irrevocably changed by the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. The Soviet decision to invade and crush Prague Spring and the reform-minded communist government of Alexander Dubček represented a setback for humanity, the arts, and politics. The invasion introduced what George Steiner has called the muse of the censor, but importantly, this muse, which rewarded the work of artists and intellectuals and activists with prisons and punishment, was not omnipotent. Rather, in trying to crush a democratic movement and trying to silence a culture, the invasion unwittingly generated, over 2 decades, the power of subversive art, oppositional politics, and some of the world's greatest literature. Justly, the 1968 invasion created the conditions for resistance that gave birth to one of the most beautiful democratic movements of our lifetime, the Velvet Revolution, led by the always optimistic and uplifting Maslov Havel. With Havel's move into the position of a prominent dissident intellectual, which brought with it years behind bars and harsh punishments, he dove deeply into the depths of Czechoslovakian culture and thought about the nation's national liberation movement in 1918, led by Tomas Masaryk, the founder of the First Republic. Havel remembered the tyranny of the Nazi occupation and knew that Anton Dvorak, Sigmund Freud, Rainer Maria Rilke, Franz Kafka, and the brilliant science fiction writer Karl Čapek, who coined the term robot in 1920, came from his society and his culture. He knew that even Hollywood, one of America's most cherished institutions, had been transformed by the filmmakers from the Czech New Wave, many of whom were forced into exile after 1968. After all, Milos Forman, the 2-time Academy Award winner for his movies One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Amadeus, was a close personal friend. We are indeed fortunate to have this week to have this amazing lineup of speakers and musicians who have traveled from around the world to join us in the commemoration of Prague Spring and its aftermath. This is an A-list from the Czech Republic and beyond, chosen carefully by several core groups on campus over 2 years. In history, I had an initial planning committee formed by Alexander Vizanski, Gerald Steinecker, Hanna Weisserova, and INU Assistant Vice President Steve Duke. At the university level, Associate Vice Chancellor Sonia Feitenbaum traveled with me to Prague to meet some of our invited guests for the first time. And I had Patty Simpson, Chair of Modern Languages and Literature, and Mark Clinton. Where are you, Mark? There you are. Mark Clinton, Hickson Lead Professor of Piano in the Glencore School of Music, working with me for more than a year to build this comprehensive and integrated program connecting my department to campus. Mark put together the beautiful Prague Spring program for tomorrow night's concert in Kimball Hall, and he helped arrange for the Jazz Ensemble Masterclass with Tony Ackerman and Martin Kreukville, right, tomorrow afternoon. I also want to thank Carrie Morgan in the Sheldon for searching its vaults to find the Joseph Sudek photography displayed upstairs, and Rachel McConnell for helping me arrange these events in the Sheldon this week. And I'd like to thank Kay Walter in Love Library, who allowed us to use the amazing Joseph Joustin photographs retrieved by the awesome assistance of Joss Castor in archives and special collections. In Love Library, Melissa Setter and Joan Barnes helped arrange for and place the photographs for Alan Pyer's photography exhibition this week, and for Alan Pyer, I just saw you back there, Alan Pyer's exhibition that will take place on Friday during the First Friday event. I encourage you all this week to view the Joseph Sudek, the Alan Pyer, and the exhibitions in Love Library throughout the week. Other members of the Prague Spring 50 Field of Dreams ground crew are, in history, Barb Bullington, Megan Brown, Zarob Chakrabarti, Donna Devlin, and Daniel Alisi. In the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Office, led by Dean Joe Francisco, I had Terry Piper, Mike O'Connor, Justin Gibson, Lisa Maupin, Brianna Garrickson helped me with everything we did. I also want to thank Deanne Gaiman and Leslie Reed in University Communications for helping spread the word about this event. And I am very appreciative of Victor Martinez and the Foundation for helping me so much. It takes a field of dreamers to pull off something this ambitious, and this was only possible because of these amazing and hardworking people. So please join me in thanking them. Most importantly, in Prague, I had my brilliant and happy co-organizer, Mariana Chapkova, who has been an absolute joy and a superb advocate of everything wonderful about the Czech Republic and the University of Nebraska. Mariana, you are fantastic, right? And lastly, I'd like to thank my family, my wife Jennifer, my son Seth, and my daughter Sophia for giving up so much family time as I listened like an enchanted farmer hearing curious Czech voices during the last 2 years on the windswept plains of Nebraska. Okay. Okay, now to our brilliant keynote speaker, whom I have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing. Dr. Michael Žantovský is currently the director of the Maslov Havel Library in Prague and author of the best-selling book, biography of Maslov Havel, which is for sale outside, and Michael is going to be signing books after his talk. A former journalist with Reuters and a doctor of psychology, Dr. Žantovský worked for many years in Prague's largest mental health hospital. As the Velvet Revolution unfolded, he resigned from his job as a journalist and to join Václav Havel's coalition government, known as the Civic Forum. He then served as Václav Havel's spokesperson and press secretary, and later served as the Czech Republic's ambassador to the United States, to Israel, and to the United Kingdom. And of course, he is well known as a lyricist. This is something I found out this summer, and actually wrote many songs for none other than Mariana Chapkova's famous uncle, Pavel Bobek. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Žantovský and the other Prague Spring speakers and guests.
Thank you. What about a handshake? Good afternoon. Ambassador Gmoniček warned you earlier on about how boring ambassadorial speeches can be. Well, you've had nothing yet. Ambassador, Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen. For some reason, the history of the Czech nation and of its many triumphs and tribulations is haunted by the number 8. The year 1618 marked the beginning of the 30 Years' War, which cemented the 300 years of Austrian dominance and Catholic religion over the lands of the Czech kingdom. The year 1848, just as much as elsewhere in Europe, embodied the hopes for the national renaissance and republican sentiment, whose failure led to a first massive wave of Czech immigration to the United States. 1938 was the year of the Munich crisis, which deprived Czechoslovakia of its young independence and set the world on course for the horrors of the Second World War. And 10 years later, in 1948, the communists took power in Czechoslovakia and the Iron Curtain descended over the continent for another 40 years. You may have noticed, though, that I omitted deliberately 2 major number 8 anniversaries, both falling on this year. 100 years ago, independent Czechoslovakia came into being in large part thanks to the efforts of Tomas Masaryk and the support he obtained from many Czech Americans and from President Woodrow Wilson. Incidentally, it is also 100 years ago that a novel by an alumna of this university, Willa Cather, about the struggles of a family of Czech immigrants to Nebraska, My Antonia, was published to great acclaim. And then there are the events of 50 years ago that brought us all here today, thanks to the enthusiasm and the vision of Professor Sueur, Mariana Čapková, and their collaborators at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I suppose that the intention has been not just to remember and celebrate the anniversary, but rather try to make sense of the events that transpired then. And it is not easy. The Prague Spring of 1968, and for that matter that whole year, resembled an attack of manio-depressive psychosis. You remember that I'm a psychologist. After all, it was just one of the many events of an Annus Mirabilis, a year of wonders, remarkable in equal degree for the rapid onrush of hopes and euphoria as for the sudden plunge into despair and hopelessness, for the psychedelic mirages, expressions of unbounded love, and fits of wanton violence, all of which engulfed alternately and sometimes simultaneously Paris, Berlin, Chicago, Warsaw, Belgrade, Los Angeles, Prague, and other cities, almost as if Cleo, the daughter of Zeus, and Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, had one too many. Or at least that is how you felt if you just turned 19, like I was then, and never experienced anything else than totalitarian communism with its very limited range of colors, emotions, and opportunities, and then all of a sudden a world of limitless and sometimes endless discussions, romantic adventures, and unlimited opportunities opened before you only to shut down again with a clanker of the armored hatches on the turrets of the Soviet tanks. Surely the contours of history are always sharper looking back than when it is actually happening. In reality, the Prague Spring was not born overnight on the night of the 6th of January 1968, with the departure of the Stalinist Czechoslovak leader Antonín Novotný from the top post of the party hierarchy, and his replacement by the little-known Slovak apparatchik Alexander Dubček. It had been germinating through the long end of the winter of Stalinism from the end of the 1950s and through the whole following decade. It sprang the first buds and blossoms of nonconformist thinking, daring theater, obscene dance figures of rock and roll, innovative movies, and independent journalism, many of which withered and died in the frost of the official disapproval, only to be succeeded by others more numerous and more daring still. It could be discerned in the fits of second thoughts and apostasy in many sometime loyal and steeled Komsomol cadres, much as the puberty attacks teenagers or passion surprises reasonable men in a crisis of the middle age. The milestones on this road toward the mirage of freedom turned out to be events of a supremely non-political nature, such as the first scientific conference of literary scholars on Franz Kafka, a non-person for the regime until then, in Liblice in 1963, the first film musical about forbidden teenage love, Starci na chmelu, Love Harvests in Summer, 1964, Miloš Forman's Konkurs, or Audition in English, and Lásky jedné plavovlásky, The Loves of a Blonde, in 1965, and other films of the Czech New Wave, the first night in the theater on the balustrade of Zahradní slavnost, The Garden Party, in 1963, the first produced play by the until then unknown playwright Maslov Havel, which was in its turn only a part of a major offensive of so-called small theaters with names like Semaphore, Reduta, Rococo, and others, an off-Broadway or off-of-Broadway type of movement of nonconformist theater artists. It was the unexpected public reaction against the severance by Czechoslovakia of diplomatic ties with Israel following the June 1967 Six Days War, the scandalous disobedience of leading Czech and Slovak writers at the Fourth Congress of the Union of Czechoslovak Writers at the end of the same month, and the growing resistance of Slovak politicians and intellectuals against the insensitive Pragocentric policies of President and Party Secretary Novotný, which exploded with full force at the October 1967 meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and led eventually to the removal of Novotný and his replacement by Dubček 2 months later. There was an intermezzo of a meeting of the Central Committee 2 days before Christmas, which Secretary Novotný, facing inevitable censure, famously adjourned by declaring that the lady comrades had to go Christmas shopping. After that, the Prague Spring blossomed with 1,000 flowers. 8 months, for that was all it lasted, was too short a time to bring about practical results of the new, more liberal approach of the Dubček-led team, which spent most of its energy in the struggle with the determined rearguard action of the conservatives in the party. The relaxation at the end of February of censorship brought about a flood of revelations about the Stalinist trials, the interference of the Soviet Union in the internal affairs of Czechoslovakia, and the dubious past of some of the leading communist bureaucrats, represented together with the significant opening of the borders for the travel of Czechoslovak citizens abroad, the headiest sips of freedom. The complete abolition of censorship by the National Assembly at the end of June only acknowledged the reality already existing on the ground. Many, though not all of the victims of communist injustice, were rehabilitated, many hitherto forbidden works published, and some until then undreamt of products appear in the stores, signaling the reemergence of a modicum of market mechanisms. But that was largely all. The more fundamental changes, including amendments to the Constitution to introduce a federal system for the country inhabited by two related but different nations, the Czechs and the Slovaks, and to allow for a more pluralist society, were expected to take place following the Congress of the Communist Party at the end of the year. Such fundamental changes, which never acquired more than the vaguest of shapes, however, died a premature death during the night of 20th August 1968 under the tracks of the Soviet tanks, demonstrating the so-called Brezhnev doctrine, under which a threat to socialism in one of the countries of the socialist camp meant a threat to socialism as such. Ironically, Brezhnev was absolutely right. Since the beginning, the reforms in Czechoslovakia came under the increasing pressure from the non-communist part of the society, which was unwilling to be mollified with cosmetic changes, but rather demanded more and more energetically full civic liberties, doing away with the constitutionally enshrined dictatorship of a single political party, the freedom of decision on foreign policy questions, and the removal of the command monopoly by the state of the economy. And it was not hard to imagine that were Czechoslovakia to win such a degree of freedom, people in the other communist countries, and in the end, even the citizens of the Soviet Union, would demand the same. And so, when the drama petered out several weeks later, when the futile resistance of ordinary Czech and Slovak citizens in the streets and on the barricades ceased, and when the communist leadership, forcibly kidnapped to Moscow, accepted, with a single honorable exception of František Kriegel, a humiliating capitulation to the Soviet demands, and when subsequently the policy of the so-called normalization not only did away with the modest achievements of the reform process, but embarked on the road of purges, persecution, and mistreatment of its opponents to suffocate even the smallest germs of the potential relapse of the democratic infection, there remained of the whole Prague Spring a single but crucial lesson. And on this I may differ a little with Ambassador Kmoníček, but I was there. The communist system was unreformable. Any attempt at its partial reform led either to its suppression by force or to the inevitable collapse of the whole system. Human liberty could not coexist with a political system that organized the society and its future according to a preconceived plan. The final proof of this lesson in practice was presented, though unwittingly, 20 years later by Mikhail Gorbachev. The germination and internalization of this awareness in the long twilight of the Czechoslovak normalization was to play an invaluable role in the Velvet Revolution of November 1989 and similar revolutionary events in all the European communist countries. Quite often, human progress is born not so much out of victories as out of defeats. At the same time, it may sometimes take quite long before this happens. In the event, the collaborators in the Czechoslovak political leadership, taking courage from the presence of a massive occupying force, immediately set about dismantling the meager achievements of the reform process. In 9 months, using as a pretext the spontaneous celebrations in the streets following the World Cup victory of the Czechoslovak ice hockey team over the officially unbeatable Soviet Union, something that the Cornhuskers should understand, Dubček, forever hesitating between courage and loyalty to the party and the Soviets, was fired and replaced by another Slovak, Gustav Husák, a ruthless opportunist who started to tighten the screws, and himself a former political prisoner, to persecute and jail political opponents. The purges within the Communist Party cost several tens of thousands of comrades their membership card, and purges within and outside the party cost hundreds of thousands of people their jobs. Any sign of resistance or unorthodoxy was mercilessly suppressed. In 2 years, the most reformist communist regime in Central and Eastern Europe became once again the bastion of neo-Stalinism, the Biafra of the spirit, in the words of the French writer Louis Aragon, once himself a loyal Communist Party member. The whole system wound down to its lowest common denominator, be it in culture, arts, education, or economy. All movement stopped and was replaced by a ghostly silence. It was, as Maslov Havel remarked in his 1975 letter to Gustav Husák, which ushered in the era of dissent, the quiet of a graveyard. But the lesson of August 1968 about the fundamental incompatibility of communism with freedom persisted and kept undermining any attempt of the system at recovering a modicum of legitimacy legitimacy, let alone respectability. One after another, the communist parties in the west of Europe broke off from the Soviet hegemon and attempted to practice a watered-down version of the creed called Eurocommunism, though eventually they too went under. In an ironic admission of their failure, the Czechoslovak communists internalized the lesson in a pompous 1970 document called Lessons from the 1968 Crisis Development, admitting, among other things, and I will quote, "In 1968, the Communist Party gradually ceased to be the command center of the socialist system. The daring and the aggressivity of the counter-revolution increased, while the possibility of suppressing it by means of domestic politics and force gradually weakened and eventually disappeared." Unquote. The lesson was equally internalized by the small group of people around Václav Havel and by some of the recently purged communist intellectuals. In a form of political jiu-jitsu, they started appealing to the government to practice its own constitution, laws, and international commitments, notably the 1975 final act of the Helsinki Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, in which 35 countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union, undertook to observe the human rights standards contained in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thus originated the Charter 77 Human Rights Initiative in Czechoslovakia, the Workers' Defense Committee, later renamed to Committee of Social Self-Defense in Poland, and other such initiatives throughout the communist bloc. Although the system responded with persecution, beatings, forced exile, jail sentences of several years, and in 1981, even the introduction of the martial law in Poland to suppress the Solidarność movement, it was never again able to put the gin back into the bottle. When in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power following a succession of walking dead at the helm of the Soviet leadership, he was facing a fatal dilemma: either to reassert the orthodoxy of the Marxist-Leninist totalitarianism and see the economic collapse as a result of the inefficiencies, the absurdities, and the wastefulness of the command economy, which was at the time waging a losing arms race competition with the United States, or to relax the reins on the society in the hope of bringing the economy back and risk the collapse of the whole political edifice. He chose the latter option, on occasion citing the model of the Prague Spring of 1968, and saw the inevitable happen. 20 years after the invasion, the writing was on the Berlin Wall. On the anniversary, 21st of August, 10,000 people were marching down the Wenceslas Square, singing the national anthem and braving police truncheons and German shepherd dogs. On the 28th of October, the 70th anniversary of free and independent Czechoslovakia, they did it again, and again, and again. In Poland, after almost a decade of martial law regime, the Solidarność was resurgent, entering talks with the government about sharing power. The Neues Forum in Germany organized public meetings in Leipzig and other big cities in the face of police violence. And the Soviet Union itself was falling to the thrall of perestroika and glasnost, unprecedented though limited reforms, somewhat resembling the Prague Spring. It was now only a question of time, though we did not know it at the time. The next year, the whole totalitarian edifice in the Central and Eastern Europe crumbled with astonishing speed, and with the exception of Romania, even more astonishing absence of violence. Unlike with other revolutions, implosion was probably a better term to describe it than explosion. Roundtable talks between the government and the opposition, followed by half-open elections in Poland, the breach of the Iron Curtain attained by East German discontents with the help of the Hungarian government and the people of Prague, the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November, and the eruption of the Velvet Revolution on the improbable date of 17th of November spectacularly preempting the plans of the opposition and perhaps even of the government for a final confrontation on the 10th of December, all led to the quick capitulation of the communist governments and their equally quick replacement by a mixture of dissidents, reformists, and pragmatic bureaucrats. But there was yet another lesson to be drawn from the events of the Prague Spring 20 years back. The opposition, loosely organized around the Civic Forum in the Czech part of the country and the Public Against Violence in Slovakia, was a diverse collection of liberal Democrats, former communist reformists, religious activists, and young radicals bred by the underground, largely copying the composition of Charter 77 as the largest and most influential opposition group. Once the revolution prevailed, the question of the future that few people had been seriously entertaining because of the prevailing consensus that there was not much of a future to be had, began to loom large. A small but well-organized group of reformists centered around a movement of socialist renaissance called Obroda Renaissance explicitly advocated an approach based on the policies of the Prague Spring with a liberalized political and economic system generally adhering to the socialist principles. In this, they could rely on the support, never properly gauged, but certainly existing, of many of the Czechoslovak citizens who found it hard, after 40 years of communism, to imagine a future that was radically different. A larger part of the Civic Forum, though, drew on the 12 years of the Charter 77 struggle for human rights and civic freedoms, advocating a road that would be wide open in many directions based on the free exercise of the people's will. As often happens, this debate became personified around the two plausible candidates for the presidency to replace the utterly discredited and despised Gustav Husák. Of the two, Alexander Dubček, the leader of the Prague Spring, was the better known, domestically and internationally. He was generally liked as a decent and modest man, praised for his humane and democratic instincts, and criticized for his weakness, compromises, and ultimate capitulation. The other man was Václav Havel, an intellectual with no government experience, but at the same time a man who had won an enormous moral credit, which he earned the hard way through 20 years of principled opposition to the communist arrogance, injustice, and abuse of power, and 5 years in a communist prison. In the end, it was a no contest, suggesting that the difference went deeper than the personal qualities of the two men. To the leaders and activists of the Civic Forum in Prague, as well as the Public Against Violence in Bratislava, and indeed to anyone with eyes to see, it was clear that Alexander Dubček, for all his decency and niceness, was a man of the past, representing a symbolic return to 1968 and the endless discussion about the compatibility of a pluralist political system with the leading role of the Communist Party and that of a command state economy with private property and the rules of the market, while Havel was a man of an uncertain but irresistibly tempting future of a free and open society. For all the problems, arguments, and challenges that were to come, the choice has been largely vindicated by the developments of the last 28 years. Now, it would be tempting to finish on this positive, perhaps even slightly complacent note, but there may be another lesson to be drawn. What had been achieved by the revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe with the support of Democrats in the West seemed at the time so definite and so irreversible that it tempted at least one talented American politologist to write a not entirely well-considered piece on the end of history, indicating that liberal democracy was the final stage of political evolution of societies. Not only do we now know better, thanks to the enemies of democracy around the world, but liberal democracy itself is being questioned by an increasing number of people in our own society, in our midst, who point out at its real or imagined flaws, such as inefficiency, corruption, inability to effectively defend our values, traditions, and culture against the forces of the global society and of the fake news world. There are voices questioning the usefulness of traditional political rules, constitutional checks and balances, representative democracy and division of power, offering quick fixes instead. There are even voices questioning the concepts of history, memory, and the truth itself, including the truth about our own past. But as George Santayana famously said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and that is also why events like this are so important. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your speech. I have a question that relates to the end of your speech. You are the end of your speech sounded like sort of a warning, or was it warning? Kind of a comment on current situation in Czech Republic, where there are, let's say, rising political forces that are trying to, as if, undermine democracy, democratic values, or that's what I understood you kind of wanted to say. Well, I wonder, how do you, how would you explain this sort of a change? Like, why does that happens?
Yes. By the way, let me introduce Petra Hulova, a popular Czech writer, and the question is well phrased, and what I meant to say was a warning not only directed at my own country, although I don't hide, I'm rather concerned about some things going on there recently, but it applies to most of the continent we live on, Europe, and to most of the European countries. If you look at every single election in the last 2 or 3 years, the number of votes for parties that are sometimes called populists, sometimes called anti-systemic, is invariably rising. And it's a lesson that is not well understood because it's been overshadowed by events like the victory of President Macron in France, the fact that in Germany the Grand Coalition is going to continue, etc., etc. And in doing so, it obscures the fact that the number of people voting for Front National, for the Alternative for Germany, and other of the anti-systemic parties is continually rising. And nowhere is this more evident than in Central Europe, and some of the events recently in Hungary, in Poland, and lately in Slovakia also point to a shared concern. And I want to be a polite guest, but I have some suspicion that some of this is going on in this great country as well. So, and why is this happening? I have a favorite, one of my favorite cartoons is a cartoon, 40 years old, about a character named Pogo, and Pogo, goes around and looks for all kinds of mischief and enemies, and finally comes back and says, we have found the enemy, and the enemy is us. And that strikes me as being very true. I think that we have been much too complacent in the democratic West over the last 20, 30 years since the changes in 1989. I think we did not, for a time, we almost denied the existence of the category of an enemy, as if no enemies ever existed, and they do exist, and we have been, I think, much too tolerant of corruption and political backroom dealing and things of that kind that people, I think, quite justifiably react against. So that's, for me, that's one of the factors. The other factor is the process of globalization, which has been quite often identified as a culprit, and which may have to do with the fact that although our media, our governments, our politicians are all living in the world of a global society these days because of global trade flows and investment flows and other such things that determine the success of a society, of an economy. Most individual people still live in a local society, and they don't spend every day worrying about climate change and Ebola and other global threats like this, but worry about how to get by train or bus to the next town, how to keep their job in a local factory, and how to get a decent education for their kids. And many of them apparently feel that politicians have given them up, that they've forgotten about them, that they worry about Ebola and climate change and not worry about them. And the third and last and the most complex factor that I'm only beginning to try to understand, no, not to understand, to try to understand, is what happened to global information flows and their verifiability, what happens with hundreds of millions people or more than 1 billion people on the Facebook who have a problem differentiating between what is actually true and correct and what is not true and correct, and for a long time this seemed like something every major change brings about, the chaos of what an Austrian economist, Schumacher, called creative destruction. But more recently, some of it looks to be in parts deliberate and designed, and the latest of these stories that we are trying to make sense out of is the story of the British company named Cambridge Analytica that apparently tampered with individual data and electoral processes in said countries, possibly on behalf of or with the support of Russian companies. And there's one of the designers or programmers of the company who was interviewed about this recently introduced me to a new concept which he called the concept of information dominance, meaning that with the data they have at their disposal, they are able to bombard an individual with massive amounts of information, true or false, that will basically determine what they think about an event or about a process. That's what's called information dominance, and that's very Orwellian for me, very, very scary. And I apologize for taking so long with the answers.
Hello, I have a lightheartedly serious question. I was intrigued by your integration of the number 8 across continents, literature, events that are historical. And I happen to know a little bit about the fact that number 8 is really important for the Chinese because it's linked with the idea of fortune. In biblical studies, the number 8 has relevance because it's linked to regeneration and resurrection. And so as you think in terms of social psychology about the relevance of number 8 in the future, my question is, where is 8 going to occur again? What can you predict about it? For the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, a big number that's coming up for us is 150, because the university is celebrating 150 years. And 25, we have a 25-year plan in the works, but for you it's 8, which has its own kind of magic. And so I'm wondering, what is the next important 8?
Look, I've been educated as a scientist, and I try to remain one. I mean, descriptively, there's no question that the number 8 occurs disproportionately often in Czech history, but I'm far from drawing any major conclusions from that. The science of numbers exists in many cultures, and the problem with it is that it sometimes means different things for different people. I mean, in Hebrew gematria, or in Judaism, the science of numbers assigns a number to every Hebrew letter, etc. And number 13, which for most of us in the West is such an unfortunate number that many people avoid the 13th floor in the elevators, means life in Hebrew, Chaim, and is one of the luckiest numbers you can draw. So I don't see a universal message there. I'm sorry.
Thank you. My question is, now 50 years after 1968, what is, and perhaps better way to say it, how is the legacy of Prague Spring perceived in the Czech lands and in Slovakia?
Yeah. It's hard to say, and one thing that struck me is that compared to this grand event organized at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, there is no such event I know of that has been organized or is planned for in the Czech Republic or in Slovakia. And again, largely because it probably meant different things for different people, it has had a somewhat more positive meaning for Slovakia than for us in the Czech lands, because Slovakia at least won one durable concession during 1968, and it was the federalization of the country that after 1989 they used to bring about the Slovak independence. But for many people, it's not so relevant as it used to be. It is very relevant for the people of my generation, because for us, for me, but for every peer I had, the 1968 and August 21 was the most crucial day in my life, certainly one of the 2 or 3 crucial days in my life, because that was the day when we could stop thinking and worrying about whether socialism was good or whether it was possible or whether it was reformable. It was over. For us, it was a settled question once and for all. And I think we were able to avoid, after 1989, some of the mistakes other countries were making, largely because of this. But for my children's generation, the significance of 1968 is almost nil. And we realized it in the Maslov Havel library when we planned a series of events for this 8th year, and we discovered that some of our prospective speakers or audiences were not much interested, and some even said, why do you go on about 1968, 50 years ago, and etc. So, I mean, I think it was an important milestone. I think it did play its role. I think it will remain a part of the modern Czech history, but you can't ask of people to see it or understand it as a momentous milestone like I do when they did not experience it.
I recall that this is also the anniversary of Tomas Masaryk as the president of the First Republic. And yet I don't recall hearing very much about him in the Prague Spring and the events of that time and what led up to them. And so I'm curious whether Masaryk and his philosophical thinking had much impact on the Prague Spring, and then how would Masaryk be evaluated today at 100? I'm thinking here of Zdeněk David, my historian friend, who's been writing a book for years now on the philosophy of Masaryk.
Well, I think it's helpful if you think of the Prague Spring as a play of 2 acts with an intermission, the second of which never took place. Because the process was started by the reformist communists couldn't have been started by anyone else. They had to make some concessions for the discussion to start. And for some time they controlled the topics of the discussion, and the topics all revolved around socialism this, socialism that, and is it possible to have an opposition in socialism, and is it possible to have private property in a socialist country, and to what extent do the market rules and market laws apply, etc., etc. And they were largely the ones that had been heard. They were not the only ones. There was a smaller group of people who never adhered to the socialist orthodoxy, and who were much more directly linked to the pre-war democratic Czechoslovakia, and they did invoke Masaryk and his whole legacy. But they were people like Maslov Havel and others of his ilk. And what is notable is that Havel was not a prominent voice in the Prague Spring process. He was influential among non-communist writers and intellectuals. He started the circle of non-communist writers, etc., etc., but he did not give any grand statements at the public meetings and in the media, and in reality he really became an activist following the invasion, not before the invasion. So what I mean is that if the process was allowed to continue, there would have certainly been the second act with a discussion about not just social democracy or socialism with a human face, but about democracy, period. And on this, Masaryk would be as influential as ever, and he certainly continues to be influential in the debates we had after 1989. The current Czech constitution is in part shaped on after the Czechoslovak constitution of 1920, which was in significant part Masaryk's work. The strong affiliation that the Czechs have felt and still feel for this country, for the United States, of course has to do with the foundation of Czechoslovakia and Masaryk's role in it during the First World War. Even our better than standard, by European standards, relationship with Israel is to a large part Masaryk's legacy, because he was the first European head of state who went to the British Mandate Palestine to express his support for a Jewish homeland. So he is an influence, but he was not, to my memory, and I see at least 3 other eyewitnesses here in this room of the time. I don't remember that Masaryk's name was often invoked in the first 7 months of 1968. Okay, you must be getting hungry, so maybe maybe one last question.
Well, maybe this will be an appropriate one. I want to ask you about Czechness, the spirit of being Czech, especially for people who are not specialists in Czech history. And as a modern world historian myself, I just can't resist noting the extraordinary degree of impact that the very small number of people who live in the Czech lands have had, especially in the last 50 years, on major encouragement at a global level of liberal democracy. Here in the Prague Spring in 1968, again in 1977 with the founding of Charter 77, the pursuit of human rights within the Soviet bloc, and again with the Velvet Revolution in the late 1980s. It's an extraordinary record for a small number of people that they have given to a world that needed that kind of encouragement. And we may be, as you've already suggested, again at a time in history where clouds are darkening for liberal democracy in some ways, and it looks like we could use some help again. Is it possible that there is something about the Czech people that we may hear from them again?
Well, I'm very cautious about answering questions of this kind. It is a relevant question. I mean, there is, if you look at Czech history of the last 100 years, there is a note of Czech exceptionalism in Czech letters, in political thinking, and in foreign policy questions. And it almost certainly stems from Masaryk himself. After all, it was Masaryk who wrote that the Czech question is either a global question or it is not a question at all. And in 1968, actually, it found an expression 5 months after the invasion in December 1968 in a rather remarkable exchange between two foremost Czech writers, Milan Kundera and Václav Havel, on and it was an exchange on Czech destiny. And in this debate, it was actually Kundera who argued that the Czechs, or Czechs and Slovaks at that time, had a specific mission, specific relevance because of what happened in 1968 for the future of the world, and a contribution to make, and that indeed we were an exceptional nation. To which Havel, ever a skeptic, said, but you know, what did we really plan to achieve? I mean, to win pluralist democracy, big deal. You know, what special contribution we were able to make. And in the end, he basically argued that we are people like any other, and that they are mostly, that it's mostly up to each individual to make a contribution, to play a role, and in this, you know, he saw some kind of Czech destiny, but he was strongly against mythologizing the period of 1968 and the Czech destiny as the future savior of Europe or the world. We're not much of a savior nation. We have, in our history, we have had, I think, more heretics than we had saints. Thank you very much.